In the grand halls of Eldermore Palace, where centuries of tradition echo through marble corridors, a single document would shatter the royal family forever. Queen Consort Margaret had spent 15 years believing her position was secure, her influence unshakable. But when King Edmund discovered a hidden clause in the ancient royal charter, everything she had fought for would crumble in a matter of hours. The title she thought was permanently hers would return to the woman she had worked so hard to overshadow, Princess Eleanor, the king's beloved daughter-in-law. What Margaret didn't know was that Eleanor had been quietly documenting every slight, every manipulation, every cruel whisper that had made her life a living nightmare. The reckoning was coming, and it would be more devastating than anyone could imagine. The morning mist clung to the windows of Eldermore Palace as Queen Consort Margaret Ashford stood in her private study, reviewing the day's schedule. At 58, she had perfected the art of royal composure, her silver hair arranged in an elegant chignon, her navy blue suit impeccably tailored. 15 years had passed since she married King Edmund following the tragic death of his first wife, Queen Isabella. Those 15 years had been a careful dance of establishing her authority while navigating the complex web of royal protocol. Margaret's fingers traced the edge of her mahogany desk as she considered her greatest challenge, Princess Eleanor Hartwell, her stepson, Prince William's wife. Eleanor, with her natural grace and genuine warmth, had captured the hearts of the people in a way that made Margaret's calculated charm seem hollow by comparison. The princess possessed an effortless elegance that Margaret envied deeply, and worse, she had given the royal family what Margaret never could, an heir. The tension between the two women had simmered beneath the surface for years, masked by polite smiles and formal courtesies. Margaret had worked tirelessly to diminish Eleanor's role in public engagements, subtly redirecting important charitable patronages to herself, and ensuring that Eleanor's schedule was packed with lesser events. She had whispered concerns about Eleanor's inexperience to key palace staff, and had gradually isolated her from decision-making processes. Eleanor, however, was not as naive as Margaret believed. The 29-year-old princess had been carefully observing the queen consort's machinations for years. Born Lady Eleanor Hartwell, daughter of the Duke of Westmere, she had been raised to understand the intricacies of aristocratic politics. Her marriage to Prince William 5 years earlier had been a love match, but she quickly learned that love alone wasn't enough to survive in the royal household. From her apartment in the east wing of the palace, Eleanor maintained detailed journals of every slight, every redirected invitation, every dismissive comment from Margaret's circle. She had allies among the palace staff who had served the late Queen Isabella, and remembered how different the atmosphere had been then. Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper who had worked at the palace for 30 years, often shared subtle observations about the changes since Margaret's arrival. The catalyst for the brewing storm came from an unexpected source, Professor James Thornfield, the royal family's chief genealogist and keeper of historical records. While researching documentation for the upcoming centennial celebration of King Edmund's grandfather's coronation, Thornfield discovered something remarkable in the royal archives. Buried beneath layers of ceremonial documents and forgotten correspondence was a charter signed by King Edmund's great-grandfather, King Albert III. The charter, written in formal legal language of the early 20th century, contained provisions about royal titles that had been overlooked for decades. According to the document, certain ceremonial titles traditionally held by the queen consort would automatically revert to the most senior princess of the blood royal upon specific circumstances. These circumstances included the birth of a direct heir to the throne, which had occurred 3 years earlier when Eleanor gave birth to Prince Alexander. Professor Thornfield spent weeks verifying the authenticity of the document and researching the historical precedents. The more he studied, the more significant the implications became. The charter specifically mentioned the title Princess Royal of Eldermore, a position that carried with it the patronage of 12 major charities, significant ceremonial duties, and most importantly, substantial influence in court protocol decisions. What made the discovery even more extraordinary was that the charter included provisions for the transfer of other honors that had been traditionally associated with the queen consort's role. The Order of the Golden Rose, the kingdom's highest honor for charitable service, was specifically designated for the Princess Royal of Eldermore. Margaret had held this position for 12 years, using it to elevate her status and solidify her position in royal hierarchy. Meanwhile, Eleanor was dealing with her own challenges. Prince William had been increasingly absent, traveling extensively for his military duties and diplomatic obligations. She often felt isolated in the vast palace, responsible for raising young Prince Alexander while navigating the complex social dynamics of royal life. Her attempts to modernize certain charitable approaches had been consistently blocked by Margaret, who cited tradition and protocol as unchangeable barriers. The princess found solace in her work with children's charities, particularly those focused on education and mental health support. Her natural empathy and genuine interest in making a difference had earned her respect among charity workers and beneficiaries, even if her efforts were often overshadowed by Margaret's more prominent roles. Eleanor's private secretary, Miss Caroline Webb, had noticed the growing frustration in the princess, but also her determination to find meaningful ways to contribute. King Edmund, now 63, had grown increasingly weary of the subtle tensions in his household. He loved his son and daughter-in-law dearly, and his grandson Alexander had brought him immense joy. However, he also valued the stability that Margaret had brought to his life after the devastating loss of Isabella. The king had always been more comfortable with state affairs than family dynamics, often leaving domestic royal matters to sort themselves out. The discovery of the charter would force him to confront issues he had long avoided. Professor Thornfield approached the king's private secretary, Sir Richard Hawthorne, with his findings. Sir Richard, a diplomatic man who had served the crown for 20 years, immediately understood the potential implications. He arranged a private meeting with the king to discuss the matter delicately. When King Edmund first learned about the charter, his initial reaction was surprise rather than alarm. He had inherited so many ancient documents and traditions that keeping track of every detail was impossible. However, as Professor Thornfield explained the specific provisions and their current relevance, the king began to understand the magnitude of the situation. The charter wasn't merely a historical curiosity. It was a legally binding document that had never been formally revoked or superseded. According to constitutional law experts quietly consulted by Sir Richard, ignoring the charter's provisions could create serious legal challenges to the monarchy's authority. The crown's legitimacy had always depended on respecting established laws and traditions, even when they were inconvenient. Eleanor remained unaware of these developments as she went about her daily routine. She had recently launched a new initiative to provide reading programs for underprivileged children, working closely with local libraries and schools. The project had received positive media attention, which had noticeably irritated Margaret. During a recent charity gala, Margaret had made several pointed comments about inexperienced organizers taking on projects beyond their capabilities. These comments had been overheard by several prominent supporters of Eleanor's work, including Lady Patricia Morrison, whose family had been major royal supporters for generations. Lady Morrison had grown increasingly concerned about the treatment Eleanor received and had begun quietly building support among influential aristocratic families who remembered Queen Isabella fondly. The palace staff had also begun to notice the growing tensions. Mrs. Pemberton, who had developed a protective attitude toward Eleanor, started keeping her own informal records of incidents that seemed designed to undermine the princess. From scheduling conflicts that forced Eleanor to miss important events, to forgotten invitations to family gatherings, a pattern of subtle exclusion had emerged. Prince William, despite his frequent absences, had begun to notice his wife's growing frustration. During their private conversations, Eleanor had started to express doubts about her ability to effectively serve in her role. She felt constrained at every turn and questioned whether she was truly making a difference or merely going through ceremonial motions. The prince, torn between loyalty to his father and stepmother and his love for his wife, had struggled to find solutions that wouldn't create open conflict within the family. He had attempted to speak with his father about giving Eleanor more significant responsibilities, but King Edmund had deflected these conversations, suggesting that such matters needed time to develop naturally. As winter approached, the atmosphere in Eldermore Palace grew increasingly strained. Margaret had begun planning for the centennial celebration, assuming she would play the central role in organizing the commemorative events. Her vision included highlighting her own charitable accomplishments and reinforcing her position as the primary female figure in the royal household. Eleanor, meanwhile, continued her quiet but effective work, unaware that historical forces were about to dramatically alter her circumstances. The charter discovered by Professor Thornfield would soon transform her from a marginalized princess into the most powerful woman in the kingdom, setting the stage for a confrontation that would reshape the royal family forever. The revelation came on a gray Tuesday morning in November. King Edmund sat in his private study, the ancient charter spread before him on the leather-topped desk that had belonged to his grandfather. Professor Thornfield stood respectfully nearby, having just finished his detailed explanation of the document's implications. Sir Richard Hawthorne occupied the chair opposite the king, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "You're absolutely certain about the authenticity?" King Edmund asked for the third time, his fingers drumming against the desk's edge. The weight of the decision before him seemed to press down on his shoulders. Professor Thornfield nodded gravely. "I've had it examined by 3 independent experts, Your Majesty. The parchment, ink, and seal all date to the correct period. More importantly, I found references to this charter in several contemporary documents from your great-grandfather's reign. It was clearly intended to be permanent legislation." The king studied the document's ornate calligraphy, noting his great-grandfather's bold signature at the bottom. King Albert III had been known for his progressive views on royal protocol, often making changes designed to strengthen the monarchy's connection to the people. This particular charter appeared to be one of his attempts to ensure that royal titles would reflect genuine service rather than mere ceremonial positions. "The legal implications are quite clear, Your Majesty," Sir Richard added carefully. "Constitutional scholars agree that this charter has never been formally revoked and therefore remains binding. Ignoring its provisions could create significant legal challenges to the Crown's authority." King Edmund rose and walked to the tall window overlooking the palace gardens. The bare trees and frost-covered lawns reflected his mood perfectly. He had hoped to avoid difficult family decisions, preferring to let time and circumstances resolve conflicts naturally. But this discovery forced his hand in ways he hadn't anticipated. The charter's provisions were remarkably specific. Upon the birth of a direct heir to the throne, the title Princess Royal of Eldermore would automatically transfer to the senior princess of the royal blood. Eleanor's marriage to Prince William and the subsequent birth of Prince Alexander had created exactly the circumstances described in the ancient document. What made the situation more complex was that the charter included detailed descriptions of the responsibilities and honors that came with the title. The Princess Royal of Eldermore would oversee 12 major charitable foundations, hold the Order of the Golden Rose, and most significantly, have the authority to approve or reject proposed changes to royal protocol involving charitable and ceremonial activities. Margaret's current influence derived largely from these very powers. For 15 years, she had used them to shape the royal family's public image and establish her own legacy. The thought of stripping away these responsibilities felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked to achieve. Meanwhile, in her private apartment, Eleanor was reviewing correspondence from supporters of her children's literacy initiative. The project had grown beyond her original expectations, with schools throughout the kingdom requesting participation. The enthusiastic response from educators and parents had given her a sense of purpose that contrasted sharply with the frustration she often felt in her official duties. Prince Alexander, now 3 years old, played with wooden blocks on the Persian carpet while Eleanor worked at her writing desk. His presence always brought her joy and reminded her of what truly mattered. As she watched him build elaborate towers only to knock them down with delighted laughter, she reflected on the legacy she wanted to leave for him. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Miss Caroline Webb, her private secretary, entered with an unusual expression of nervousness. "Your Royal Highness," Caroline began hesitantly, "Sir Richard Hawthorne has requested a meeting with you this afternoon. He mentioned it concerns a matter of historical significance that affects your position." Eleanor looked up from her correspondence, surprised by the formal tone. Sir Richard rarely requested private meetings with her directly. Most communication flowed through established channels that typically included Margaret's office. Did he provide any additional details? Eleanor asked, noting Caroline's apparent discomfort. "No, Your Highness. He simply emphasized the importance of discretion and asked that the meeting remain confidential until further notice." Eleanor agreed to the meeting, though she spent the remainder of the morning wondering what historical matter could possibly affect her position. She had always been interested in royal history but couldn't imagine any discoveries that would have personal implications for her role. At precisely 3 o'clock, Sir Richard arrived at Eleanor's apartment accompanied by Professor Thornfield. The presence of the royal genealogist immediately heightened Eleanor's curiosity. She invited them to sit in her private sitting room, ensuring that Prince Alexander was safely occupied with his nanny in an adjacent room. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Richard began carefully, "we have discovered a document that significantly affects your status within the royal family. Professor Thornfield will explain the details." The elderly academic spread photocopies of the charter on Eleanor's coffee table, his hands trembling slightly with either age or nervousness. "Your Highness, this charter was signed by King Albert III in 1924. It establishes specific provisions regarding the title Princess Royal of Eldermore and the associated responsibilities." As Professor Thornfield explained the charter's contents, Eleanor felt a mixture of astonishment and apprehension. The magnitude of what he was describing seemed almost impossible to believe. The title he mentioned would give her more authority than she had ever imagined possible, but it would also create an unprecedented conflict with Margaret. "I don't understand," Eleanor said slowly. "Are you saying that I should have held this title for the past 3 years?" Sir Richard nodded gravely. "According to the charter, yes. The birth of Prince Alexander triggered the automatic transfer of the title and its associated responsibilities. The delay in implementation appears to have been due to the document being overlooked in the archives." Eleanor sat back in her chair, trying to process the implications. She thought about all the times Margaret had dismissed her suggestions, all the charitable opportunities that had been redirected away from her, all the occasions when she had felt powerless to effect meaningful change. This charter would transform those dynamics entirely. "What does His Majesty say about this?" Eleanor asked, already anticipating the answer. "The king is currently considering how best to proceed," Sir Richard replied diplomatically. "He asked me to inform you of the situation and gauge your thoughts on implementation." Eleanor understood the delicate nature of the situation. King Edmund faced an impossible choice between honoring historical legal obligations and potentially devastating his wife's position and emotional well-being. The implementation of the charter would publicly acknowledge that Margaret's authority had been improperly exercised for years. Professor Thornfield added more context to the historical background. King Albert III was particularly concerned about ensuring that royal titles reflected genuine service to the people. This charter was part of several reforms designed to prevent ceremonial positions from becoming mere ornaments without substance. Eleanor asked detailed questions about the specific responsibilities and powers that would transfer to her. The scope was breathtaking: oversight of education initiatives, healthcare charities, cultural preservation programs, and international humanitarian efforts. These were exactly the areas where she had hoped to make meaningful contributions, but had been consistently blocked. "I need time to consider this carefully," Eleanor finally said. "The implications extend far beyond my personal circumstances." Sir Richard assured her that discretion would be maintained while the king made his decision. However, he also emphasized that legal experts had advised that the charter's provisions couldn't be indefinitely ignored without creating constitutional issues for the monarchy. After the two men left, Eleanor sat alone in her sitting room, staring at the photocopies they had left for her review. The medieval script seemed to pulse with significance as she read and reread the crucial passages. She thought about Margaret, who had no idea that her world was about to be shattered. Despite their conflicts, Eleanor didn't take pleasure in the prospect of Margaret's humiliation. The Queen Consort had invested 15 years of her life in building her position and legacy. Having that stripped away would be devastating, regardless of how it had been obtained. Eleanor also considered the broader implications for the royal family's public image. The transfer of such significant responsibilities would inevitably raise questions about why the change was occurring. Palace communications would need to craft explanations that preserved everyone's dignity while acknowledging the historical necessity of the adjustment. That evening, Prince William returned from a week-long diplomatic mission to find his wife unusually subdued. During their private dinner, Eleanor struggled with whether to share the day's revelations. The oath of confidentiality she had given Sir Richard conflicted with her desire for her husband's counsel. "You seem troubled tonight," William observed, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Did something happen while I was away?" Eleanor squeezed his fingers, drawing comfort from his presence. "I received some unexpected information today about royal protocols. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details yet, but it may significantly affect our lives." William's expression grew concerned. His wife's careful phrasing suggested something more serious than typical palace politics. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Just be prepared for some major changes in the coming weeks," Eleanor replied. "And remember that sometimes historical forces beyond our control shape our paths in unexpected ways." Meanwhile, Margaret remained completely unaware of the developing situation. She spent her evening reviewing plans for the centennial celebration, making notes about guest lists and ceremonial procedures. Her assistant had prepared detailed briefings about each planned event, with Margaret's central role prominently featured throughout. The irony was striking. While Margaret planned celebrations of royal tradition, that same tradition was about to dramatically alter her position. The charter she knew nothing about would soon strip away the very authority she was using to organize events commemorating her husband's family history. King Edmund, alone in his study late that night, continued to wrestle with the decision before him. He understood that delaying action wouldn't make the situation disappear. Constitutional law was clear. The charter's provisions were legally binding and couldn't be ignored without undermining the crown's authority. The king also recognized that his personal preferences couldn't override centuries of legal precedent. His great-grandfather's charter had been designed specifically to prevent the kind of situation that had developed over the past 15 years. Ignoring those safeguards would betray the very principles that gave the monarchy its legitimacy. As midnight approached, King Edmund made his decision. The charter would be implemented, but he would insist on a careful, dignified process that preserved everyone's honor as much as possible. Margaret would need to be informed immediately, and Eleanor would need support as she assumed responsibilities she had never expected to hold. The transformation was about to begin, and there would be no going back. The confrontation Eleanor had dreaded came the following Wednesday morning. King Edmund had requested a private meeting with Margaret in his study, the same room where he had examined the fateful charter just days before. Margaret arrived punctually at 9 o'clock, elegantly dressed in a burgundy suit she had chosen specifically for what she assumed would be a discussion about the centennial celebrations. "Edmund, darling," Margaret said, settling into the familiar leather chair across from his desk. "I've made wonderful progress on the celebration plans. The guest list is nearly finalized, and I've arranged for the most prestigious charitable organizations to present their achievements." King Edmund's somber expression should have warned her that this wasn't the meeting she expected. He had spent sleepless nights rehearsing how to deliver news that would devastate his wife while preserving their marriage and family relationships. "Margaret, we need to discuss a serious matter," he began carefully. "Professor Thornfield has discovered a historical document that affects your current responsibilities." Margaret's smile faded as she noticed the charter spread on his desk. "What kind of document?" The king explained the discovery with as much gentleness as possible, but there was no way to soften the charter's implications. As he spoke, Margaret's complexion grew increasingly pale. Her hands, usually poised and steady, began to tremble slightly as she grasped the magnitude of what he was telling her. "You're saying that Eleanor should have held these positions for 3 years?" Margaret's voice carried a note of disbelief that gradually transformed into anger. "That everything I've worked for was based on a mistake?" "Not a mistake," King Edmund corrected gently. "The charter was simply overlooked in the archives. No one was aware of its provisions until now." Margaret stood abruptly and walked to the window, her composure beginning to crack. 15 years of careful positioning, relationship building, and reputation establishment were crumbling in a single conversation. She thought about all the charitable organizations that had come to rely on her leadership, all the relationships she had cultivated with international dignitaries, all the respect she had earned through dedicated service. "And what about the centennial celebration?" she asked, her voice barely controlled. "Am I to be humiliated publicly by having my responsibilities transferred to Eleanor in front of everyone who has worked with me?" This question struck at the heart of King Edmund's own concerns. The celebration would bring together hundreds of dignitaries, charity leaders, and international guests who knew Margaret as the primary female figure in the royal household. Managing the transition without causing public embarrassment would require extraordinary diplomatic skill. "We will handle the transition with dignity," the king assured her. "Eleanor doesn't even know about the charter's full implications yet." We can structure this as a gradual evolution of responsibilities rather than an abrupt transfer. Margaret turned from the window, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hurt and fury. You don't understand what you're asking of me, Edmund. These organizations, these people, they've become my life's work. I've invested everything in building these relationships. The king rose and moved toward his wife, recognizing the genuine pain beneath her anger. Margaret, your contributions haven't been meaningless. You've accomplished remarkable things, and that won't be forgotten, won't it? Margaret's laugh carried a bitter edge. When Eleanor takes over the Order of the Golden Rose, when she becomes the patron of organizations I've nurtured for years, what exactly will be my legacy? That I was keeping someone else's seat warm? Meanwhile, Eleanor was experiencing her own emotional turmoil in a very different setting. She had requested a meeting with Mrs. Pemberton, ostensibly to discuss household arrangements, but actually seeking the wisdom of someone who had observed royal family dynamics for 3 decades. They met in Mrs. Priscilla Pemberton's private office, a cozy room lined with photographs from various royal events spanning decades. The housekeeper had always been a maternal figure to Eleanor, offering guidance and support during the difficult early years of her marriage. Mrs. Pemberton, Eleanor began hesitantly, if circumstances were to suddenly grant someone significant new responsibilities, how would you recommend they approach the transition? The older woman's knowing smile indicated she had already heard whispers about recent developments. Palace staff networks were remarkably efficient at sharing information, especially when it concerned changes that might affect their daily routines. Your Highness, Mrs. Bowman, Pemberton said carefully. I've learned that major changes in royal households require patience, wisdom, and above all kindness to those who might be affected by the transition. Eleanor appreciated the housekeeper's discretion in not directly acknowledging what they were discussing. I'm particularly concerned about maintaining relationships and ensuring that good work continues regardless of who oversees it. Mrs. Pemberton poured tea from a delicate porcelain service, giving herself time to consider her response. I remember when your late mother-in-law, Queen Isabella, faced similar challenges. She always said that real leadership meant making others feel valued rather than displaced. The mention of Isabella brought complex emotions for Eleanor. She had only known William's mother briefly before the Queen's tragic death in a car accident, but Isabella's reputation for grace and diplomatic skill had become both an inspiration and a burden. Eleanor often felt compared to her predecessor, usually unfavorably by those who had preferred Margaret's more traditional approach. I never want anyone to feel that their contributions weren't appreciated, Eleanor said, even when disagreements have existed. Mrs. Pemberton nodded approvingly. That attitude will serve you well, Your Highness. Change is never easy for anyone, but it can be managed with dignity when approached thoughtfully. The conversation was interrupted by Caroline Webb's arrival, with news that Prince William had returned early from his latest diplomatic assignment and requested an immediate meeting with his wife. Eleanor excused herself, wondering if her husband had somehow learned about the charter development. She found William in their private sitting room, still wearing his travel clothes and looking unusually agitated. Their greeting embrace lasted longer than usual, as if he were drawing comfort from her presence. Eleanor, I need to know what's happening, William said without preamble. I received a very strange call from Father this morning asking me to return to the palace immediately. He mentioned something about historical discoveries and family decisions. Eleanor faced a dilemma. She had promised confidentiality to Sir Richard, but her husband clearly deserved to know about developments that would profoundly affect their lives. She chose to honor her marriage while respecting the spirit of her agreement. There has been a significant discovery about royal protocols, she said carefully. It appears that certain titles and responsibilities may need to be redistributed based on historical documents that were previously overlooked. William's expression grew increasingly serious, as Eleanor explained what she could without violating her confidentiality agreement. His military training had taught him to quickly assess strategic situations, and he immediately grasped the implications for family relationships. This involves Margaret, doesn't it? He asked. And the tensions you've experienced over the past few years? Eleanor nodded, relief flooding through her at finally having someone with whom to share the burden of this knowledge. I'm genuinely concerned about her reaction, and the impact on your father." William took her hands in his, studying her face intently. "How do you feel about assuming greater responsibilities? Is this something you want?" The question cut to the heart of Eleanor's internal conflict. She had spent years feeling frustrated by her limited ability to effect meaningful change, but she had never wanted advancement to come at someone else's expense. "I want to serve effectively and make a positive difference," she replied honestly. "But I don't want to succeed by destroying someone else's position or happiness." Their conversation was interrupted by a summons for William to meet immediately with his father. As he left for the king's study, Eleanor remained in their sitting room, watching Prince Alexander play with his toys, and wondering how different his future might be if his mother suddenly became one of the most influential women in the kingdom. The meeting between King Edmund and his son was brief but intense. William's military experience made him particularly effective at grasping complex situations quickly and offering practical solutions. "Father, we need to consider the long-term implications for the family's unity," William said after hearing the full explanation. "Margaret's reaction could affect not just her relationship with Eleanor, but your marriage and the broader family dynamics." King Edmund appreciated his son's strategic thinking. "What would you recommend?" "Give Margaret a meaningful role in the transition," William suggested. "Let her help train Eleanor and introduce her to key relationships. Make it collaboration rather than replacement." The wisdom of this approach was immediately apparent. Rather than simply stripping away Margaret's responsibilities, the transition could be framed as an expansion of royal charitable work that required both women's expertise and experience. However, implementing this approach would require Margaret's cooperation, which seemed increasingly unlikely given her reaction to the initial news. The king knew that his wife's pride and sense of purpose had been fundamentally challenged, and wounded pride could be extraordinarily difficult to overcome. That evening, the royal family gathered for what appeared to be a normal dinner, but felt charged with unspoken tensions. Margaret maintained perfect composure, engaging in polite conversation while revealing nothing of the morning's devastating revelations. Eleanor, aware of the undercurrents but unsure of exactly what Margaret knew, struggled to maintain her usual warmth. Prince Alexander's innocent chatter provided welcome relief from the adult tensions, but even his presence couldn't completely dispel the atmosphere of impending change. As the evening concluded, each family member retreated to private quarters to contemplate a future that would be fundamentally different from anything they had previously imagined. The chess pieces were positioned, the stakes had been revealed, and the real game was about to begin. The explosion came 3 days later during what should have been a routine charitable planning meeting. Margaret had requested the session to discuss final arrangements for a major fundraising gala, one of 12 events that would soon be transferred to Eleanor's oversight according to the ancient charter. The meeting included Lady Patricia Morrison, several charity directors, and unfortunately for everyone involved, Eleanor herself. Eleanor had attended reluctantly, aware that her presence might create tension, but unable to avoid the meeting without appearing to abandon her current charitable commitments. She sat quietly at the conference table in the palace's blue drawing room, trying to remain inconspicuous while Margaret conducted business with her usual authoritative efficiency. The trigger came when one of the charity directors, Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the Children's Education Foundation, innocently asked about long-term planning strategies. "Your Majesty," Dr. Mitchell addressed Margaret, "we're hoping to establish a 5-year development program for our literacy initiatives. Should we coordinate with Princess Eleanor's current reading programs to avoid duplication?" The question hung in the air like a lit fuse. Margaret's composure, maintained through sheer willpower for 3 days, finally cracked under the weight of knowing that Dr. Mitchell's organization would soon report to Eleanor instead of her. "I think," Margaret said with dangerous calm, "that coordination questions will be resolved very soon through administrative adjustments that are currently under review." Eleanor felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. The phrase administrative adjustments carried unmistakable undertones that made several attendees shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Lady Morrison, whose aristocratic instincts were finely tuned to detecting conflict, attempted to redirect the conversation. "Perhaps we should focus on the immediate gala arrangements and address broader coordination issues at a later date." But Margaret was beyond diplomatic deflection. 3 days of suppressed fury and humiliation had reached a breaking point. Actually, Lady Morrison, I think our guests deserve to understand the full scope of the adjustments being contemplated. Eleanor's heart began racing as she realized what was about to happen. She caught Margaret's eye across the table, silently pleading for discretion, but the Queen Consort's expression showed no mercy. You see, Margaret continued, her voice maintaining perfect royal modulation while delivering devastating content, it appears that historical documents have been discovered suggesting that certain charitable oversight responsibilities should be redistributed among the royal family. The charity representatives exchanged confused glances, unsure of what they were witnessing or how to respond. Mitchell, who had worked with Margaret for 8 years, looked particularly bewildered. What exactly does that mean for our organizations? Dr. CSS approached. Mitchell asked hesitantly. Margaret's smile became razor-sharp. It means, Dr. Mitchell, that Princess Eleanor will be assuming responsibility for your foundation, along with 11 others that I have developed and nurtured for the past 15 years. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Eleanor felt blood rushing to her cheeks as every pair of eyes turned toward her. She had hoped for a gradual, dignified transition that would preserve everyone's relationships and reputation. Instead, Margaret was destroying those possibilities with surgical precision. I see, Dr. Mitchell said slowly, clearly struggling to process this unexpected development. When would this transition occur? Excellent question, Margaret replied before Eleanor could respond. Perhaps Princess Eleanor could enlighten us about the timeline for implementing these historical discoveries. Eleanor realized she had to respond, but anything she said would either reveal confidential information or appear evasive. The timing and details of any administrative changes are still being finalized by His Majesty, she said carefully. Margaret laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. How diplomatic. I'm sure Dr. Mitchell and her colleagues appreciate such clarity about the future of their organizations. Lady Morrison, recognizing a royal family crisis in progress, stood abruptly. Perhaps this discussion would be more appropriately continued in private family settings. Oh, I think our charity partners deserve to understand what's happening, Margaret said. After all, they've invested years in building relationships and developing programs under current arrangements. They should know that all of that is apparently being swept away because of some musty document that a genealogist found in the archives. Eleanor's patience finally reached its limit. She had endured years of Margaret's subtle undermining. But this public humiliation of everyone in the room was unacceptable. Your Majesty, she said firmly, I believe Lady Morrison's suggestion is appropriate. This conversation should continue privately. Should it? Margaret's eyes flashed with anger that was no longer concealed. I find it interesting that you're suddenly concerned about appropriate behavior, considering the circumstances. The charity representatives were now clearly witnessing a personal conflict that had nothing to do with their organizations. Mitchell attempted to excuse herself and her colleagues, but Margaret gestured for them to remain seated. Please don't leave on account of family awkwardness, Margaret said with false brightness. Princess Eleanor and I are simply working through some transition issues that affect everyone's future working relationships. Eleanor stood, recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond recovery. I apologize to everyone for this unexpected disruption. I believe it would be best if we reschedule this meeting to allow for private family discussions. How thoughtful, Margaret said, also rising. But before our colleagues leave, perhaps you could explain to them why their work relationships are being disrupted by historical documents that you apparently knew about before I did. The accusation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Margaret was suggesting that Eleanor had somehow conspired to hide the charter discovery, which was entirely false, but would be impossible to refute without revealing confidential details about the timeline. That's not accurate, Eleanor said quietly, trying to maintain dignity while the situation deteriorated around her. Isn't it? Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. Isn't it convenient that ancient rights are discovered just when someone needs to justify taking over responsibilities they couldn't earn through their own merit? The room fell dead silent. Even Lady Morrison, experienced in navigating aristocratic conflicts, seemed shocked by the directness of Margaret's attack. Eleanor felt tears threatening but refused to show weakness in front of witnesses. I think, Eleanor said with carefully controlled emotion, that this conversation has moved far beyond appropriate boundaries for this setting. Dr. Cade, Mitchell and her colleagues were now standing clearly desperate to escape what had become an intensely personal confrontation. "Your Majesties," Dr. Mitchell said hesitantly, "perhaps we should reschedule when everyone has had time to consider these developments." Margaret turned her fury toward the charity director. "Oh, you'll have plenty of time to consider developments, Dr. Mitchell. You'll need to build entirely new working relationships while your programs suffer during the transition period." Eleanor had heard enough. "That's unfair to doctors, Mitchell, and everyone else who has worked so hard for these organizations. Personal conflicts shouldn't affect their important work." "Personal conflicts?" Margaret's voice rose beyond royal modulation for the first time. "Is that what we're calling the systematic dismantling of 15 years of dedicated service?" Lady Morrison finally intervened with the authority of someone whose family had advised royalty for generations. "Your Majesties, this discussion must continue privately. The charitable organizations involved deserve better than to be caught in family disputes." Eleanor seized the opportunity. "Lady Morrison is absolutely right. I apologize to everyone for the disruption, and I assure you that all organizational transitions will be handled with careful attention to maintaining program effectiveness." Margaret stared at Eleanor for a long moment, her expression a mixture of rage, hurt, and something approaching hatred. "How reassuring," she said finally. "I'm sure everyone feels much better knowing that their future is in such capable hands." With that devastating parting shot, Margaret swept from the room, leaving Eleanor to face the awkward aftermath alone. The charity representatives filed out as quickly as politeness allowed, clearly eager to escape the royal family drama they had unexpectedly witnessed. Lady Morrison remained behind, approaching Eleanor with maternal concern. "My dear, that was extraordinarily difficult for everyone involved." Eleanor sank back into her chair, the full impact of the confrontation finally hitting her. "Lady Morrison, I never wanted this transition to happen this way. I had hoped for cooperation and dignity." "I know," the older woman said gently, "but you must understand that Margaret feels her life's work is being taken away. That kind of loss creates desperate behavior." Eleanor nodded, recognizing the truth in Lady Morrison's observation. But the damage was done. Word of the confrontation would spread through royal circles within hours, creating exactly the kind of public humiliation that King Edmund had hoped to avoid. The carefully planned, dignified transition was in ruins, and the real battle for the future of the royal family was just beginning.